What is the craziest plot twist you've seen in real life? I dated a girl who was very beautiful, but also incredibly high maintenance. She'd complain that I never spent any money on her, even as we walked out of a restaurant where I'd eaten salad and drank water so she could enjoy a $50 meal. On our two meager paychecks, mine as a server, hers as a cook, she was always talking about traveling halfway across the world to places like Hawaii, Mexico, Japan, or Australia. One night, I was at a party, smoking on the porch with the guys, and one of them said, "So you're dating her? You're so lucky. I've had a crush on her since 4th grade." Now he was what you might call a rich guy. His family had tons of money. In that instant, it clicked. I shouldn't be dating her. He should be dating her. So, in a moment of drunken clarity, I yelled, "Hey baby, come out here. I need to talk to you," and told her exactly what I thought, that if she wanted someone to spend money on her, here's her guy. At first she thought I was joking, but I persisted. It was an awkward evening for everyone, but I managed to break up without too many tears or drama. A couple weeks later, word around town was that they were officially a couple, a cute pair, and of course, everyone was buzzing. He's taking her to Spain. Well, she always did wanted to travel. Good for them. A couple months later, I ran into him and I asked, "Hey bro, how was your trip to Spain?" He did not answer. There was silence. "How's your girlfriend?" I asked again. "Well, she got married," he said, "to a guy in Spain. She stayed there." I didn't know what to say after that. Story 2. I heard about a couple who couldn't conceive, but their neighbor had 3 kids. They couldn't afford artificial insemination, so the husband asked the neighbor to help by impregnating his wife. The neighbor agreed. Months went by with no pregnancy. Eventually, the neighbor's wife admitted that she had cheated, and it turned out the neighbor himself was infertile. After that, the husband ended up suing the neighbor for breach of contract. I'm not sure what happened after that. Story 3. One of my buddies was living in a dorm during his freshman year. A couple of weeks in, he started having constant stomach pains every morning, so he decided to see a doctor. The doctor asked about his daily diet, and my friend mentioned he always drank a protein shake right before bed. The doctor told him to stop drinking it at night and see if that helped. That night, he skipped the shake and went to sleep. Sometime in the middle of the night, he woke up to his roommate being inappropriate. It turned out his roommate had been putting stuffs in his protein shake so he could take advantage, which was what had been causing his stomach problems all along. Story 4. My first roommate in college was super Catholic and did not approve of my older boyfriend. As an attempt to save me, she invited me to her friend's so-called celibacy celebration while I was doing homework in the commons. A chill wind picked up, and I sensed it was time to leave. When I turned around, the only doorway was blocked by a circle of people holding hands and quietly chanting, "No intimacy until 30. No intimacy until 30. As I tried to push through, their chanting got louder. I eventually made it out, but she had thrown away all of my high-end toys and my Suicide Girls book. That was it for me. I moved out after just 1 quarter. Over a year later, a few friends and I were comparing horror stories about roommates. I shared my story, and a new friend shared hers about a super loudly soloing roommate. The rest of the group didn't have much to add, so they voted between the 2 stories. Mine won by a small margin, only for us to find out that both of our stories were about the same roommate, just a year apart. Oh, and by the way, she didn't actually throw out my toys or my book. Story 5. This one might need a flowchart. My husband's parents are kind of a couple of ne'er-do-well hillbillies, each having been married several times. He and his brother are the children of both parents' first marriage, when they were both around 20. They have no other siblings, but many step-siblings came and went over the years, with my husband, as the eldest, often having to babysit them. Even before my husband and I met, there were rumors in the family that his dad had cheated on his mom while they were married and had a daughter, my husband's half-sister, whom he had never met. Apparently, he had even avoided dating women from his hometown within a certain age range because one of them could have been his sister, though he didn't know which one. Well, a few years ago, the half-sister finally emerged and said she wanted to get to know her brothers. It turned out she wasn't a stranger at all. My husband and his brother had known her as one of their stepsisters. Here's what happened. My father-in-law had cheated on his wife with a married woman and got her pregnant. When that woman's husband found out, he divorced her and out of pure spite, married the homewrecker's ex-wife and baby mama, my mother-in-law. So the half-sister ended up living with her biological dad's ex-wife, and my husband and his brother knew her as a non-biological stepsister. When that spite-based marriage eventually fell apart, they lost touch, unaware that they were actually more closely related than they thought, until the man she had always thought was her dad confessed on his deathbed what had really happened. Country life is wild, y'all. Story 6. In primary school, we had a WWI memorial lesson, and the teacher asked if anyone had relatives who had fought in the war. One friend brought in a picture of his great-great-grandfather with his wife. Another girl brought a picture of her great-great-grandfather with his wife. The teacher remarked that the men looked similar, put the photos side by side, and looked shocked. We all gathered around and realized it was the same man. He had kept both marriages secret. Both families had been married privately, and the two kids who were cousins had no idea. Story 7. This is a long and meandering story that came to a climax about 12 years ago. It's one of the most bizarre things that's happened to me and left me rattled and puzzled for a long time. When I was in college, my father retired and moved to New Orleans. He had lived there in his 20s and 30s, and his two sons from his first marriage, my half-brothers, still lived in the city. He moved into a cool apartment complex with a swimming pool in the center courtyard and a lot of sociable people his age. One of them was a retired Army general, whom I'll call Tom. My dad and Tom were the same age, and both were Korean War veterans. My dad had served 4 years in the Marines during the latter part of the war, while Tom had stayed in the Army and risen through the ranks. Tom had been through Ranger School and the Special Forces pipeline and was considered a country expert on Korea. He spent most of the Cold War in Korea, training ROK Marines, running simulated World War III scenarios, and working closely with a large private corporation, doing semi-classified quasi-spy work I won't name here. He retired shortly before September 11th. At the time, he was a full colonel and was promoted to Brigadier General, 1 star just before retirement to boost his pension. That promotion was kind of an old boy club professional courtesy. After 9/11, the government expanded the Federal Air Marshal Service and asked Tom to come out of retirement to lead the restructuring. They wanted someone without apparent command, and since he'd been out of the Army for about a year, he was a good fit. To give him clout among other generals, GS-15 civilian employees, and private sector executives he'd be working with, they promoted him to Major General, 2 star. Colin Powell personally pinned his 2nd star on him at the White House. At the time, I was in the Marine Reserve and about to graduate college. I hadn't yet been called up for OIF or OEF, so I was looking for my first grown-up job. My dad suggested that being an air marshal could be fun for a year or two, even if it wasn't exactly something I was interested in. I already had a clearance, was an expert on the range, and was a friend of the 2 star running the program, so I was probably a step ahead of many other candidates. My dad arranged a phone call with Tom to discuss my options. By this point, I'd met Tom many times when visiting my dad. He was one of the kindest men I've ever known. We'd sit around the pool and I'd pick his brain endlessly about his military experiences and the spooky adventures he was allowed to talk about. As a young enlisted Marine, it's hard to describe the feeling of being close with a 2 star general. I had seen a general maybe 3 times by then. If you're a lance corporal in a rifle platoon and a major shows up in the barracks, you snap to attention and bark out, "Attention on deck," like Darth Vader just walked in. Somebody with stars on their collar could give you a heart attack just by existing, so shooting the breeze with Tom was pretty special for me. Tom was a widower and an old Southern gentleman, dating women occasionally. Although he didn't smoke, he always carried a Zippo lighter to light a lady's cigarette. One day by the pool, he lit a cigarette for me, and I noticed the Zippo had a Ranger crest on it. He told me his daughter had given it to him years before. At the time, he thought it was gaudy. He wasn't the type to advertise his status, but after his daughter died, he came to cherish it. She had been an avid equestrian and had died in a car accident in Costa Rica in the 70s or early 80s while there for a riding event. His wife passed away from cancer some years later. Tom's apartment was covered in photos of his daughter in riding gear. She was beautiful. The dated feel of the portraits, frozen in the 70s, combined with the quiet apartment and Tom's outwardly calm demeanor, made the whole scene heartbreakingly tragic. We talked on the phone about the Air Marshal program for about an hour. He couldn't answer many questions because of operational security, but he gave me what he could. In the end, another job came up and I didn't join the Air Marshal program. My dad kept me updated whenever Tom came back to New Orleans on leave. Once Tom told my father they'd run computer simulations of a terrorist sprinting up an airplane aisle, and the only part of the simulated attacker that stayed relatively motionless was the groin. So the doctrine they developed emphasized striking low, because on a plane you want to hit a person, not the fuselage. My dad, being a physician, told Tom that there would be a tremendous amount of bleeding, which could be a problem if they wanted to subdue someone alive. Curious and inventive, my dad spent his free time sketching a solution. A sort of jockstrap with a hemostatic agent in the cup. He gave the design to Tom. A few months later, Tom came back and told him that a prominent pharmaceutical company was producing a prototype. My dad didn't want money or credit. He was just glad to have helped solve a small problem for his country. After the Iraq invasion, Tom left the Air Marshal program and went on to work on Condoleezza Rice's staff as a national security aide. All in all, everyone loved Tom. He and my dad became very close friends in just a few years. Tom would take my brother's kids to Saints games, and in the family-friendly neighborhoods where everyone spent evenings on their porches visiting, he became a beloved figure. He'd swing by some nights, and my niece, nephew, and all the neighborhood kids would come running, shouting, "Mr. Tom," just like they do in the South. I was mobilized in 2004, and my father died shortly before I deployed to Iraq. I went to New Orleans on emergency leave, and my brothers, their wives, my sister, my girlfriend, and I drove to Grand Isle, Louisiana, to scatter his ashes in the Gulf. Tom wore his full dress uniform. After the ashes were in the water, he removed his white gloves and threw them in as well. I hadn't known this tradition before, but I was deeply touched. He choked back tears, his voice thick with emotion. Later, he took my sister and me to one of the finest restaurants in New Orleans and told us he was always there for us. Anything we needed, anytime. I fell out of touch with Tom after deploying and returning home. When Katrina hit, I called my sister-in-law Maggie to see if everyone was okay. I asked about Tom and she said, "Oh my God, you didn't hear about Mr. Tom?" I tensed and said, "No, what happened?" What she told me settled over me slowly, like slime. Maggie's neighborhood was underwater, so she, my brother, and her kids went to a friend's house on high ground. There were about a dozen others in the same situation. One of them was Tom's older sister, who would have been in her 80s. She and Maggie knew each other by name and reputation, but hadn't met until then. Maggie introduced herself and asked about Tom. His sister was worried, having heard nothing from him since the storm. Maggie said, "Well, I wouldn't worry. I bet the government has a list of VIPs to check on, and Mr. Tom is surely on it." Tom's sister said, "Maggie, I don't know what Tom has told you, but not a general, not a ranger, no air marshal program, no Condoleezza Rice, no Colin Powell, no bleeding out through the groin problem for my dad to solve, none of it." Tom was in reality a penny-ant lawyer. What was true was that his sister's deceased husband had been a Korea vet, a ranger, a high-ranking officer, and involved in intelligence work. Tom had grown up admiring everything about his brother-in-law. At some point, Tom's dull, real-life lawyer job faded from his own perception, replaced entirely by fantasies. The most disturbing part, in his narratives, he killed off his daughter and ex-wife. Even though they were very much alive, they had just written him off when his detachment from reality became too much. Remarkably, after Katrina destroyed his apartment building, his daughter had the heart to take him in. My girlfriend watched my face collapse as I talked to Maggie, and she was just as devastated when I told her afterward. I had so many questions. What if I had followed up on the air marshal thing and said, "Hey, Mr. Tom sent me"? Then some of the particulars hit me. He'd said he was only promoted to the general ranks after retirement, which could explain why he wasn't listed on the Army's general officer biographies. He probably had a ready answer for the air marshal story too. It was like watching someone write a screenplay, creating plausible explanations for every kink in the story or detail of character development. Maggie ran into him a couple months after Katrina. He was all smiles, and she said, "Stop, your sister told me everything." He just laughed and said, "Oh, that old bat's crazy." That was the last any of us ever heard from him. I've Googled him since but never found anything. I'm just glad my father passed away without ever knowing the truth. He would have been devastated, and knowing him might have physically confronted Tom. I'm saddened that my father was played for a fool in his final years, but I'm also sad for Tom. The gloves in the water and all that were phony, but his tears weren't, nor his graciousness at dinner with my sister and me. With the life in Washington, D.C., being mostly a facade and his relatives having written him off, my dad and our family were really the closest people he had in his life. Story 8. The only one I can think of right now is about my old roommate and her boyfriend. Because we had extra space, my mom sometimes rented out rooms to people. One time we had an 18-year-old roommate who was dating a 40-year-old guy. He was a total mooch. He'd tell her all sorts of lies, like I have this $1 million idea in the works, just to keep her spending her parents' money on him. He was living out of his car and would try to sneak into our house for a free place to stay. He'd eat our food from the fridge, and on top of that, he even kicked our dogs when he thought no one was watching. Her parents, who were paying her rent, had explicitly told my mom she was not to see this guy. For about a year, she acted like she wasn't seeing him anymore, but somehow we always found out that wasn't true. One time, we found him hiding behind one of those giant Costco teddy bears in her room. Another time, he rang the doorbell at 10 o'clock on a Friday night, showed up with a clipboard, and had the audacity to list off to my mom all the things he wanted to change about our house. Like, seriously, how many times do we have to tell you that you're not even allowed here? Despite all our efforts, she kept seeing him, and every time we caught him with her, we had to inform her parents. Plot twist. Right before the 40-year-old boyfriend started seeing my roommate, he had been having an affair with her mother for a while. The mom eventually ended things when she realized all he did was lie and that he couldn't support her, let alone himself. And then, he ended up dating her daughter. What really weirded me out was that the daughter knew he had been involved with her mom right before he started dating her. Story 9. Years ago, when I was in college, I drove back to my hometown to spend Valentine's Day with my best friend since we were both single. She organized a group outing for ice skating on Valentine's Day. A lot of people we knew from high school were going to be there, including a girl my best friend didn't get along with. When I asked why she had invited her, my friend started talking about how much the girl had grown and matured, and how impressed she was. I thought, great, I love a good success story, and I was genuinely excited to see her. Well, the ice skating plans never happened. That girl had gotten into an argument with her mom and her ex, and in the middle of it all, she said something that really worried them. Out of concern for her safety, they decided to call for help, and she was taken to the hospital. My best friend and I decided to visit her there to check in and see how she was doing. Apparently, when a young woman is admitted to the hospital for mental health concerns, they run a variety of tests, including a pregnancy test, and sure enough, they had tested her. That's when she dropped the bomb on us. She was 8 weeks pregnant. We congratulated her, of course, even though a baby was probably the last thing she needed. Bless her heart, she seemed self-aware enough to realize it and kept saying, "No, this is not a good thing." But wait, there's more. You might have thought the pregnancy was the biggest twist, but little did we know there was more to come. After leaving the hospital, my best friend and I decided to stop by the grocery store for some chocolates and sparkling grape juice to enjoy together. While we were there, we ran into a guy my best friend had known since elementary school. They made some small talk and somehow the conversation turned to the girl from the hospital. And that's when things got really interesting. He mentioned that the last time he had seen her was a couple of months ago while hanging out with a mutual friend. My best friend filled him in. Skanky girl was in the hospital because she had threatened to harm herself and we had just visited her. And here's the kicker. She was 8 weeks pregnant. When he heard this, his face went completely white. He explained that the last time he had seen her, about 8 weeks earlier, they had hooked up without protection. A few weeks later, she had called him to say she was pregnant and that the baby was his. At the time, she hadn't had enough money for an abortion, so he had borrowed $500 from friends and family to help her. So now, the big question for all of us was, if she was still pregnant, what had happened to the money? It's been almost a decade, and we still don't know the answer. Story 10. During the last year of my grandfather's life, he struggled with dementia and had a hard time keeping track of reality. Before he was moved into hospice, he kept insisting that there was a man in the house, someone who came around at night, taking his things and using his belongings. My grandmother would gently reassure him that no one else was there, that it was just the two of them. But his confusion only got worse, and his doctor eventually increased his medication, believing he was slipping further away from reality. Fast forward to my grandfather's funeral, and a man showed up who wasn't known to most of the family. It turned out he was an old friend of my grandmother's who had come to offer his support. In a small town like ours, it wasn't unusual for people who knew the deceased at some point to show up. About a year later, my grandmother casually mentioned that she was seeing someone, none other than the man from the funeral. At first, it seemed innocent enough. They'd gotten to talking at church, and we thought it was sweet. Then, a little later, sweet, innocent grandma casually mentioned that it was already their 3rd anniversary. Grandpa had died 2 years earlier. That man, the one showing up at the funeral and later dating Grandma, was the same person Grandpa had been seeing in the house every night. He was the reason Grandpa seemed like he was losing his mind, the reason everyone thought he was hallucinating. He was the reason Grandpa was medicated to the point of being almost comatose for the last terrible year of his life. Story 11. My maternal grandfather's father was an immigrant. His mother divorced him when my grandfather was very young, remarried, and had my grandfather adopted by her new husband, though he was always called a stepfather because he was a drunk and Grandpa hated him. Mom grew up hearing that her biological grandfather was French and that her grandmother divorced him after he bought a dress for another woman. She was so angry, she refused to admit they'd ever been married, and he was deported back to Europe. When Mom was in high school, her grandmother let it slip that her biological grandfather wasn't French at all. He was Italian. Italians had been on the wrong side of World War II, so Grandpa lied to avoid even more prejudice than he already faced for being raised by a single mother and having an immigrant father. Grandma even told Mom she'd never have married him if she'd known he was Italian. When I was a small child, the story had become that my great-grandfather was Italian, bought a dress for another woman, and my furious great-grandmother divorced him and had him deported. Turns out my mom's genealogy obsession finally paid off, though not in the way she expected. My biological great-grandfather was never deported. Instead, he'd moved to Detroit, remarried a woman whose name was almost identical to my great-grandmother's, and had a son. By the time Grandpa was in his 80s, he discovered he had a half-brother he'd never known existed. It gets even messier. Not only might my great-grandfather never have bought a dress for another woman, but there's another version of the story. He used to joke that he and my great-grandmother weren't really married, since they never had a Catholic ceremony. She was Baptist, he was Catholic. Great-grandma apparently got furious, threatened divorce if he joked about it again, and then actually went through with it. Here's the kicker. They may not have been legally divorced. Allegedly, my great-grandmother paid her uncle, who was a judge, to finalize the divorce because my great-grandfather didn't want to do it. There's no official record of it, and apparently he had a hard time remarrying afterward. Suddenly, the story of her needing to go on a trip just to get remarried makes a lot more sense. My great-grandfather also tried to stay in contact with my grandpa and provide for him, but my great-grandmother would not allow it. None of her relatives were even permitted to mention my great-grandfather and were afraid to talk about him until after she passed away, so we believe that is true. We have met my great-uncle. He is frighteningly similar to my grandfather in ways that can only be explained by genetics. They both laugh the same way, do this unusual side hug where they pull you in tightly, and like to clasp both of your hands when talking about anything involving feelings. He has the same eyes as my mom and shares her interest in sports and genealogy. It is pretty cool, and I wish we had discovered him sooner. Story 12. My buddy started dating this girl from the opposite side of the country. She said her dad was a mega-rich businessman in Singapore, or maybe the Philippines, and that she had a large trust fund. Things got pretty serious. She rented a luxurious condo here, bought a brand new Escalade, got a dog, and he moved in with her. Being the type of guy he is, she even went and had some cosmetic surgery. She told him she had to travel back across the country every so often to visit her sisters and family. This went on for a year or two. My buddy always wanted to go with her to meet her sisters and family. And finally, she agreed over Thanksgiving, but she said he'd have to get a hotel room because she didn't want her family to know she was living with someone outside of marriage. Thanksgiving morning, he wakes up to a knock on the door. She's not in the room, so he answers it, and it's some random guy who turns out to be her husband. The sisters she had pictures of and always talked about were actually her children, and the wealthy man was her husband, not her dad. They sat and talked for a good half hour, and later that evening I got a phone call asking if I could pick him up at the airport. Oh, and she claimed she was our age at the time, around 24, but it turns out she was 38. Crazy. Story 13. I spent my whole life teasing my little sister about how she looked nothing like me or our dad. I'd make your adopted jokes constantly. Over time, it became an inside joke between us. I'd say, "We found you on the doorstep," and she'd reply, "Thank God, that means I'm not actually related to you." My parents sometimes frowned, thinking it was mean, but my sister could take a joke and even played along herself. A couple of years ago, I found out she really was the product of a brief affair. My dad had accepted her as his own, and my parents had kept it a secret from everyone. They told her last year. Now my maybe your adopted jokes are still around, but somehow they're 100 times funnier. Story 14. I got married young, and we wanted to have children. We tried for 4 years with no success. Plot twist number 1. My wife suddenly became pregnant. Plot twist number 2. She admitted she was pregnant because she had been sleeping with my best friend and wanted a divorce so they could raise the child together. We got divorced, and I had a fertility test done, which confirmed that it is unlikely I will ever have children. I moved on and entered a serious relationship with an old friend from high school. She was perfect. Plot twist number 3. My ex-wife's baby was born, and he looked just like me. A DNA test a week later confirmed that he was mine. My new girlfriend was devastated, but she was a real champ. She agreed to stick by me and help. We got married, arranged split custody with my ex, and had 2 more children over the next several years. We are incredibly happy, with a wonderful family and fulfilling careers. Plot twist number 4. My ex-wife is completely infertile. Doctors cannot figure out how she became pregnant in the first place. She is very bitter that I have the family and life she always wanted. Plot twist number 5. Sometimes the good guys really do finish first. Story 15. This happened to my friend, but I got partly involved, as best friends do. When we were in college, my friend matched with a slightly older guy on Tinder and hit it off with him immediately. They scheduled a date for Friday night, and she texted me about how excited she was. Friday came and went. They had an amazing time, even agreeing to meet the next afternoon for another date. They texted late into the night with him telling her how much he liked her and that he could not wait to see her again. The next day, radio silence. She was confused and texted him a couple of times to figure out what was going on, but he never responded. The day after that, she tried again. This time to make sure nothing bad had happened, but still nothing. I was out of town, texting her to help keep her anxiety in check, until she finally asked me to call his number just to see if his phone was broken or something. I agreed, convinced the call would go straight to voicemail and that I'd hang up immediately. Nope, the jerk picked up on the first ring, even though it showed as an unknown number. After I hung up, he texted my number asking who it was, so his phone wasn't broken, and I had no answers for my friend. She was understandably upset, but got over it quickly since there was really nothing she could do. About 6 months later, she sent me a link to his Facebook profile that had just popped up in her suggested friends list. It turns out he was married and had been for a couple of years. His drop-dead gorgeous wife was working with Doctors Without Borders in Africa at the same time he was seeing my friend. While his wife was saving lives overseas, he was hopping on Tinder to mess around with college girls. That finally explained the ghosting. What an a-hole. Story 16. I graduated in law and got engaged to the woman I had been with throughout university. We both applied for the same graduate program and ended up working in the same office in Canberra. 3 months before our wedding, I found out she was cheating on me with our mutual boss, and I called off the engagement. Long story short, things got very ugly, and we ended up in a bitter court case over property. Canberra is a fairly small city, and the legal world there is even smaller. I seemed to run into my ex everywhere I went, which started to really wear me down. Apparently her too. Eventually, I applied for an Australian government overseas development role in Tuvalu, a Pacific island with about 11,000 people. It was a prestigious posting, with only 2 positions available for a 2-year contract on a rotating basis. I was successful and moved to the island to begin my posting, only to discover that my ex was the other successful applicant. I then spent the next 2 years sharing a tiny office on a tiny island with the one person I honestly loathed more than anyone else in the world. Story 17. At my grandfather's funeral, we were all gathered to say goodbye. He'd always been a fairly reserved and distant father. From what I understood, the kind of northern dock worker who came home expecting dinner on the table, then headed out to the pub via the bookies for the evening. After an unsurprising heart attack, the family came together. We're a big but close bunch, and we knew everyone there. Family, friends, neighbors, or so we thought. Then a man showed up, about the same age as my dad and his siblings, whom none of us recognized. Long story short, he turned out to be my grandfather's son, from another family, from another marriage, one that had lasted just as long as his marriage to my grandmother. My grandfather had somehow managed to maintain 2 marriages for over 40 years, 7 children with my grandmother and 1 with this other woman. They had always known about us and kept their distance, and apparently my grandmother knew about them but never said a word. It turns out he hadn't been going to the pub every night after all. Story 18. I knew a woman who was going through divorce proceedings with her husband. He was constantly argumentative and borderline abusive toward her, always shouting and demeaning. Then, just as the divorce was nearing its final stages, he very suddenly died. The autopsy revealed that he had a massive, undiagnosed brain tumor that had been physically altering his personality. Afterward, his wife was overwhelmed with guilt. She lashed out at nearly everyone she spoke to, and in the process lost many friends. Story 19. One guy I worked with was expecting a baby. He told me about his girlfriend, saying, "Yeah, she's pretty big, but she's amazing. She's the one for me." I didn't know him very well at first, but as he talked about the pregnancy, and I offered encouragement about how his life was about to change, we bonded a bit. His baby was due just before Christmas, and he missed our work Christmas party because his child was supposedly being born. We all expected him to be out on paternity leave, but a few days later, he showed up again. I feared the worst, that the baby hadn't made it. It turned out his girlfriend had been lying about being pregnant just to spend more time with him. Looking back, the way he'd mentioned her weight for no real reason probably meant she was heavy enough that it wasn't obvious whether she was pregnant or not. She had shown him someone else's ultrasounds, and they had even discussed baby names and how they'd raise their child. I have no idea what she thought would happen once 9 months passed and no baby appeared. At least she eventually told the truth. A more manipulative person might have faked a miscarriage. Still, it was deeply messed up. Not long after, the guy left, and I never found out how he coped with it all. Story 20. In 1991, I was 19 and had just signed the lease for my first apartment on my own. I'd also just received my first paycheck from my new job and decided to deposit it at an ATM, a first for me since I'd always gone into the bank before. 2 weeks later, I got my bank statement in the mail and was horrified to see that I had only $1.87 in my account. That couldn't be right. I should have had at least $200. I'd been so careful with my spending. I panicked, realizing I had come within $2 of bouncing my very first rent check. I was literally reaching for the phone to call the bank when it rang. It was the police, asking if my ATM card had been stolen. I checked my wallet and saw it was missing. Since I worked at a theater pub and usually got cash tips, I didn't use the card much. I told them I was about to call anyway because about $200 had vanished from my account. "Well, we've got your card and your $200, so come down to the station," they said. I couldn't figure out how they had both my card and the cash. It didn't make any sense. So confused and curious, I got in my car and drove to the police station. The detective explained that someone, let's call him Bob, had pulled up to use the ATM and noticed a man acting suspiciously, shifting around as if trying to avoid the camera. After finishing whatever he was doing, the man left quickly, jumped into his car, and sped away as if fleeing the scene. Curious, Bob went up to the ATM and inserted his card. It immediately popped back out. Thinking it was just a glitch, he tried again, successfully withdrawing $200, but then another card popped out, my card. It turned out the crook had left my card in the machine before taking off. Bob realized that he'd just withdrawn the money from my account, not his own, so he did the honest thing. He took my card and the cash straight to the police and reported what had happened, effectively stopping the theft before it went any further. The detective gave me a description of the suspect. According to Bob, it was a man about 5'7", with brown hair and round gold-rimmed glasses. I laughed and said, "So, about my height, my hair color, and glasses like mine." Before it hit me, Bob had just described me. I had never deposited a check at an ATM before, so I must have looked suspicious as I leaned back and forth, trying to follow the on-screen instructions, filling out the envelope, typing in the amount, and so on. Then, like an idiot, I forgot to take my card out when I left. And I drove off at high speed because, well, I was 19 and that's just how I drove everywhere. Worried the detective might think I was wasting his time, I didn't admit that I was the crook. I just thanked him, took the cash, and left with the money I had technically stolen from myself. Somewhere in a box in my closet, I still have the police report where I'm listed as both the victim and the perpetrator. Story 21. I once had a job interview early in my career when I was trying to relocate about 500 miles away. I brought along prototypes and samples of my work, hoping to make a strong impression. It was a 9-hour drive, but everyone I met seemed so enthusiastic that I felt confident the job was mine. I didn't get it. Instead, I found another position in the area and took that. 6 months later, the same company called me back, this time to interview for the position above the one I'd originally applied for. They offered me the job on the spot, and I ended up working there for nearly a decade. A few months in, some of my new coworkers told me that the man who had held the position before me, the one who would have been my boss if I'd been hired the first time, had said that my samples and prototypes were beyond his understanding. He didn't want to hire someone who knew more than he did. Well, I suppose he doesn't have that problem anymore. They fired him and replaced him with me. Story 22. One of my close friends in high school started spending a lot of time with a guy from the other public high school in our city. Before long, they were practically inseparable. She had a huge crush on him and was convinced he liked her too, but she'd never had a boyfriend before and was too shy to make the first move. One night, while they were hanging out, he told her he had something big to confess. She braced herself, thinking he was finally going to say he liked her. Instead, he told her he was gay. They stayed close friends after that, and a few months later at a party, he introduced all of us to his younger brother, just a year apart in age. The two of them looked alike, shared the same personality, and had nearly identical senses of humor. Fast forward 20 years, and my friend is now happily married to that younger brother. Her best friend is her brother-in-law, and he and his husband are the godfathers to her kids. Sometimes that painful crush on the gay guy really does pay off in the end. Edit. For anyone who feels bad for her husband for being the second choice or thinks she just settled for the guy she couldn't have, here's what you're missing. By the time she met her now husband, she was already completely over his brother. They became friends first, and it wasn't until a year or so later that their friendship slowly turned into something more. Her crush on his brother was brief, innocent, and purely teenage. She loves her husband entirely for who he is. Sure, the brothers share similar qualities, but those traits, kindness, humor, warmth, are exactly what she finds attractive. That's all it ever was. Trust me, there's no victim in this story. Everyone got their happy ending, and everyone is loved. Story 23. When I was a sophomore in high school, we had a string of thefts happening during class. Our school was small, with no hall monitors or cameras in the halls, so it went on for months without being caught. Finally, the gym teacher happened to catch a kid in the act of stealing from someone's backpack. There was a commotion in the halls, and my class ran out to see what was happening. It turned out the thief was the principal's son. The gym teacher had him by the wrist, telling everyone he'd just caught him stealing. Then, in classic attention-seeking fashion, the kid pretended to pass out and collapsed to the floor. Everyone just rolled their eyes and went back to class. So cringy. Story 24. An 85-year-old woman, the widow of a hero soldier from World War II, had lived a life of quiet hardship, neglected by friends and children, forced to sell her house because she couldn't afford it and move into a much smaller one. Yet she was always helping others, unfailingly polite and kind. Then, to the astonishment of her entire village in Scotland, she announced that the new tenant of the castle near her small cottage had asked her to marry him. He was also elderly, but a brilliant geneticist, the very man who cloned Dolly the sheep. He was a knight, a professor at Edinburgh University, and a multimillionaire many times over thanks to his patents. They got married last year. All her wealthy high society friends, those who had neglected her and only invited her over to their manor houses so she could pour tea and play the perfect hostess, now have to defer to Lady Wilmot. Edit. Here's a bit more her first husband, David Haddon. Every year, long after his death in the 1980s, strange little trinkets and sweets would arrive at his house. They came from the Himalayas, often in envelopes covered with hundreds of Anna stamps, or sometimes unstamped, bearing non-European writing and symbols. My mother, curious, asked Sarah what it was all about. Apparently, when the Second World War broke out, he immediately signed up as a second lieutenant and went to France with a regular regiment. There was just one problem. Whenever he or his platoon faced any real danger, he would literally faint, fall to the floor in a swoon. He earned the humiliating reputation of being windy. They were going to cashier him, which would have been a terrible shame in a war where everyone else was fighting. Instead, they sent him to India to join the Indian Army. There, some doctors diagnosed his condition, severe narcolepsy triggered by adrenaline. He was classified as the British Army equivalent of 4F, the worst health category possible. He was then put in charge of a group of Gurkhas, all of whom had been seriously wounded and could no longer fight. They were sent to a hill station where they could do no harm. Anyway, he somehow ended up on the same plane to this remote camp as Orda Wingate, who, if you don't know, was a general and widely regarded as the father of guerrilla warfare. Wingate was complaining that he wasn't being given proper troops to conduct his Chindit raids deep behind enemy lines into the jungle, crawling with bloodthirsty Japanese soldiers. Haddon immediately volunteered himself and his men, and off they went, carrying out real First Blood-style attacks. 300 miles into Burma with nothing but airdropped supplies. They attacked supply lines, ambushed staff cars, and blew up rear bases. The only problem, whenever Haddon was in the middle of an attack, he could conk out and keel over. But nothing fazed his men. They would prop him up and carry him in a litter while storming a machine gun nest or any other objective. Lord Mountbatten, who was head of the Southeast Asia Command, heard about one river crossing carried out under heavy machine gun fire with Haddon, by now Major Haddon, being carried on a bed of palm leaves atop his men's heads as they waded forward fast asleep. Mountbatten mentioned Haddon in dispatches, a very prestigious honor, and had him flown to Delhi for a personal meeting with the Viceroy. When His Excellency emerged from the meeting, he wore a puzzled expression. Very odd man. I congratulated him. Many congrats. Credit to Britain and all that. He stood up, saluted, and fainted. The little gifts and cards he received every year from the Himalayas after the war were from his old Gurkhas. These extraordinary brave fighters had grown fond of him, and they genuinely believed that the reason he kept falling asleep in the face of danger was because he was too brave. Anyway, that's the story Lady Wilmot told my mother, and my mother told me. How much of it is true, I'm not entirely sure, but I hope most of it is. Story 25. I worked at a bank call center as a workforce admin. We had a supervisor with unusually high staff turnover. People would be doing fine, then suddenly their performance would tank and they'd quit. In one case, a guy who was quitting made a huge scene, called out the supervisor, insulted him, even pushed him, and ended up being restrained by coworkers. At the HR meeting, the supervisor went off on him, listing every mistake he'd ever made, even bragging about how he had to clean up after this guy. The entire time, the employee sat silently, saying nothing, just staring at whoever spoke to him. When the HR rep asked if he had anything to add, he pulled out a tape recorder and played recording after recording. Of what? Of the supervisor literally threatening him, harassing him, belittling him, being a complete asshole. Apparently, this supervisor would single out overperforming agents and make their lives miserable to protect his own position. I'm told the supervisor just stared at his feet and nodded when he was told he was fired. The agent was also let go, but he walked away very well compensated. Story 26. When I started school, I realized that being raised by your grandparents wasn't exactly normal. As I got a little older, I learned why. My biological parents had given me to them. I was told my mother was sick, and I assumed I must have been just a few months old at the time. No one spoke much about my biological father or his family. I only met his father and stepmother once when I was a toddler. I rarely saw my biological parents while they were together, and only began seeing my mother regularly after they divorced when she moved back into the family home and we became roommates. Years later, I found out my biological father remarried and quickly started a new family. Then, when I was around 10, I was helping my mom, my grandmother, with something that involved going through her lockbox of important papers. I found a document from the custody case, dated just 2 months after I was born. I asked questions, and what I learned was shocking. My biological parents had given up on me after just a week, and my biological father had actually planned to throw me in a dumpster. Luckily, my biological mother called her own mother, and I wasn't thrown away. My dad had been at work while all this was happening, and when he came home that day, he discovered there was an extra person in the house for the foreseeable future. After my father changed his plan from throwing me out to putting me in foster care, my grandparents filed for custody. The thought of not knowing where I was had been literally nightmarish for them. My biological dad popped up a few times when I was older, and the last time we were in contact through email, he tried to claim that I had been kidnapped, which honestly is ridiculous for so many reasons. We don't talk anymore. I already have a dad, and he's the human equivalent of if Shepard Book and Ron Swanson were fused into one person. Story 27. I was working a new position at a store for a company I'd been with for years. I try to get along with all my coworkers, joking, teasing, sometimes hanging out after work to make the day go smoothly. One coworker, let's call him James, often teased me back. One day he wagged his finger and said, girlfriend, clearly joking. I tried to tease back and said, oh come on James, only girls can get away with the head bob statements, and we all know you'd make an ugly girl. James's scraggly bearded face immediately burst into laughter, and everyone around him looked terrified. He laughed and laughed, saying I didn't really understand it, but I'd said something incredibly funny. Everyone else looked like the color had drained from their faces. It turned out James had been born a girl. I'd met him 3 years after his full transition. He took it in good humor, and I told him to compliment his doctors because he was clearly living a life that made him happy. Underneath it all, I was mortified, and I've never made a gendered joke since. You really never know. Story 28. I have a coworker, Joe, a great guy, and he has an equally wonderful wife, Nina. Over the years, and even before she met Joe, multiple doctors had told Nina she would be unable to get pregnant naturally because of issues with her ovaries and fallopian tubes. She and Joe decided that a child-free life was fine with them. They got married and lived happily together for 12 years. When they first started out, they didn't have much, but over time, they advanced in their careers and built a nice life for themselves. Eventually, they reached a point where they felt comfortable enough to buy a sports car, something Joe had always wanted. It was the first brand new, off-the-lot car they had ever owned. By this time, Joe and Nina were in their early 40s and figured they'd just coast into retirement. About 6 months after buying the car, winter came, and Nina caught a case of the flu she just couldn't shake. She felt run down, nauseous, and generally not herself. After about 3 weeks, she decided to see a doctor. The doctor asked if there was any chance she could be pregnant. She laughed and said, I've been married for 12 years and never even had a scare. Multiple doctors told me it's just not possible for me. No way. But the doctor insisted. Humor me. Let me just rule it out. Do a urine test. Eager to figure out what was wrong, Nina took the test, and as it turned out, she was pregnant. So, in their 40s, and after 12 years of living just the two of them, they found out they were expecting. Once the initial shock wore off, they were genuinely excited, though they did have to sell the sports car since a 2-seater wasn't going to cut it for a family. A few months later, their son John was born, a happy, healthy baby. They became a family of 3, and they still are today. John just finished his first year of high school. He's a great kid and super smart too. Life has a funny way of surprising you. You never really know what it's going to throw at you. Story 29. I was putting myself through college as a single mom when I met another woman my age who was going for the same degree. We became friends, or at least that's what I thought. One day, she suddenly started hating on me and got a bunch of people to join in. She accused me of cheating and even tried to get me kicked out of college. She tried to get me fired from substitute teaching by claiming I was dishonest and spread rumors that I was involved with other people's husbands. And now we're both around 30 years old. This is some high school level drama she's still pulling. I was trying to move on when I met this other woman going for the same degree. She told me the same thing had happened to her with that same woman. We both graduated with our associate's degrees and then went on to pursue our bachelor's. One day, my friend called me to say she ran into that woman at a restaurant where she waitressed. The woman and her group started mocking me, calling me a loser. My friend told them I was graduating summa cum laude with my bachelor's and working at General Motors. The woman started screaming so loudly that the manager asked her to leave. It turned out she had flunked out of her associate's program. got fired from her nail salon for being difficult, hadn't worked since, and her husband was about to leave her because of all the money she had spent on her education. I'm still pretty satisfied about the karma there. Story 30. When I finished university, I started a job about an hour away from my parents' house. The hours were terrible, and the job turned out to be the exact opposite of what I'd been promised in the interview. I toughened it out for almost a year, slowly sinking deeper into depression over the whole situation, until one night I lay in bed until 4 a.m. and had a sudden revelation. I was going to quit. The next morning, I show up to work, and my regional manager tells me she has a job offer for me for the following year. She wants me to move 3 hours away for exactly the same salary I'm making now, with no moving bonus and no additional benefits. I call my parents during my break and completely melt down. They're so worried that they drive up after my shift just to make sure I'm okay. They ended up taking me to dinner at a local casino and told me to swipe my points card to see if I had a food coupon. I ended up losing $100 and we left for the night. I didn't show up for work the next day. I hopped on a plane to visit my girlfriend, who was away at school. As I walked off the plane, I turned off airplane mode and saw a voicemail. The casino had called me. "Hey, give us a call back, congrats." When I called, they asked if I was sitting down. I had won a draw for $10,000. I hadn't even known I'd entered, but apparently swiping my points card automatically entered me. I flew back Sunday night and picked up the money. Monday morning, I walked into work and slid a picture of myself holding a giant check across my boss's desk. Shortly after, I left for a better job with a better company. Story 31. This will probably sound super cliche, but my grandma had some rough days in the hospital, and we were all fearing the worst. The family was taking turns keeping her company. This was way before cell phones existed, so communication wasn't as easy as it is today. One day, my dad got a call. My aunt was with her at the time. I don't know exactly what was said, but my dad understood that she had passed. We rushed to the hospital as soon as he hung up, because he wanted us to say goodbye. During the whole car ride, my dad was bawling his heart out. We arrived at the hospital, completely distraught. We already knew which room she was in, so we went straight there, ready to say our goodbyes. Except she wasn't dead at all. She was sitting in her bed, eating soup with a nurse, like any other day. I was about 7 years old at the time, and I totally freaked out, but I was extremely happy about the whole situation. We talked with her for a few minutes, and my dad couldn't stop crying and hugging her. My aunt wasn't in the room at first, but she arrived a little later. My mom was incredibly mad at her for the false alarm, and my aunt insisted several times that she never actually said our grandma was dead. In the next half hour or so, the rest of our family arrived at the hospital because everyone had received a similar call from my aunt, and everyone assumed grandma had passed. I don't remember all the details, but as far as I recall, grandma had experienced a minor stroke and her heart stopped for a few seconds. Somehow, my aunt exaggerated the situation on the phone, and that's how the whole mix-up happened. We ended up basically having a little party in her room that day since all of us were together, which was a very rare occurrence in my extended family. I felt that the sadness we'd experienced before arriving made us appreciate the happiness even more. Somehow that impromptu family gathering seemed to lift her spirits, and she managed to live for a few more years after that. Story 32. When I was 5, I remember going to a wedding reception for one of my friend's older sisters. I vaguely knew it was a bit scandalous. She was only 18, just out of high school, and he was much older. That's all I knew, and it rarely came up in conversation with my friend or their family. 10 years later, I was in high school on the debate team, chatting with the coach about random stuff. Somehow the conversation turned to the team before he was coach. He told me that the previous teacher who ran the team had been kicked out for having a relationship with one of the students. He mentioned the names, and my jaw hit the floor. That was the same wedding reception I had attended as a kid. Story 33. My entire life has been full of plot twists, but here's a snapshot. My mom had 8 children, so my oldest sister and I are 19.5 years apart. I'm the youngest, she's the oldest. My second oldest sister and I do not get along. In fact, only 3 of my siblings still talk to her because she's caused so much chaos in our otherwise close-knit family. This sister has a daughter, my niece, who is just 4 months younger than me. We were really close growing up, but now we live on opposite sides of the continent and don't get along anymore because my sister spread lies about me, causing my niece to literally hate me. I found out from my mom, who heard it through one of our siblings, since she doesn't talk to my niece's mom either, that my niece was pregnant. She would have been 18 at the time. At first, I didn't think much of it. During her pregnancy, one of my siblings kept showing my mom pictures, and something about them seemed off. Then one night around 1 in the morning, my mom got a call that my niece was going into labor. 2 hours later, she got another call saying my niece was walking around the city by herself. She had lost the baby. That's when my mom knew something wasn't right and got the full story from one of our siblings. One of my siblings told my mom that my niece went into labor and went to the hospital. They said the hospital told her she was miscarrying. Supposedly, she then told her boyfriend not to come, but when he insisted on coming, she was transferred to another hospital, gave birth to the baby, and then left immediately, wandering the streets of the city on her own. My mom thought, she's lying, but my siblings are very sensitive when it comes to this sister because first, she's bat crap, and second, none of us can stand her. A month later, I was in the car when my mom asked if I wanted to hear about my niece. I told her no, but honestly, I could use a dose of crazy for the day, so why not? Apparently, when my niece found out she was pregnant, her boyfriend told her to have an abortion, or he would leave her. She did have the abortion, but then went around telling everyone that she had kept the baby and that the dad had decided to stay. She lied about everything. All the pictures were fake and edited. All the appointments were made up. That night, she really was wandering the streets alone, but only as a cover to make it look like she was giving birth. Honestly, it doesn't surprise me that she made the entire thing up. Before she finally admitted she had lied about the pregnancy, she was posting pictures of herself the day after she supposedly gave birth, sitting cross-legged, jumping around, and touring her city like nothing happened. I can't stand that sibling or her side of the family. They're all bat crap, and the less contact I have with them, the better off I am. Story 34. It's a very minor thing, but my friends and I still laugh about it. For context, we're all Catholic. I was in a room with a bunch of friends, and we were supposed to be productive, but that never really happens. All the boys were causing a huge ruckus, even knocking over a few tables, while the girls quietly played card games in the back. We shared the building with a bunch of secretaries and nuns who absolutely despised us and would do everything possible to get us kicked out. A few minutes after table number 2 got toppled, the girls started warning the boys that we would all get in trouble if they didn't stop. Barely moments later, one of the secretaries walked into the room, looked the loudest boy dead in the eye, pointed, and quietly said, "When you have a moment, come meet me in my office." We all panicked, convinced the boy had just gotten us kicked out of the building and we really needed that space since it was the only one we could use for free. Fear radiating from his entire body, he left for the office. After about 10 minutes, some younger kids came into our room, still panicking, and told us the boy had been on the phone with his parents, and it sounded serious. This only sent us into an even bigger frenzy. Finally, the boy returned, holding a bright pink slip. At first, he looked traumatized, and we were all begging him to tell us what happened. Then he grinned widely and said, "She asked me to serve a mass tomorrow." Story 35. After a 3-year Reddit hiatus, I'm back to give an update and share my Twilight Zone-esque story about reuniting with my dad after 20 years. We decided to finally meet in July 2015, after a few years of Facebook comments and regular phone calls. He was coming from Missouri, and I was traveling from California to meet in Oregon, where my sister lives. I was incredibly nervous, anxious, and at the same time, excited. I had always felt like the black sheep of my family, but after talking to him for a few years, we had become really close. When I was building my car, I would call him, and he would patiently talk me through repairs, sending links and YouTube videos for every step. He had tried to be a good dad despite the distance, and he was genuinely thrilled at the thought of finally seeing me in person. He arrived the day before me to catch up with my sister, and because he wanted to be there to pick me up from the airport, it was a Thursday afternoon when I arrived, and seeing him at the gate as I walked out was surreal. He was taller than I expected, smiling from ear to ear. I hugged him and my sister, and we took off. It was amazing. My cousin was getting married the following Saturday, and since my sister had to work, she dropped us off at my uncle's house that night so I could meet him and help set up for the wedding. My dad and I had some time to bond, talk about cars, and hang out with my biker uncle. I finally felt comfortable and excited about my life, happy to meet this other side of my family that I fit in with so well. Cue the wedding day. I had known my dad for all of about 2 days. I spent the day helping set up, cooking, cleaning, and trying to talk to him. He seemed really distant that day, wandering off, mingling with other people, inviting others into our conversations, asking me to make him food, generally acting like he had other things to do. I figured it was no big deal, but I was a little annoyed. The wedding happened, followed by an after-party that lasted all night and well into the next day. For most of that time, my dad was off with a friend and pretty much unavailable. I let it be and spent the time meeting a bunch of amazing people who were genuinely happy. I finally got to meet my dad. Monday morning rolled around, and I woke up a little late. I made some coffee and sat outside waiting for my dad to get up. I was out there for about an hour. It was strange that he wasn't up yet. He was usually an early riser, up with the sun. A bad feeling started to settle in, so I went to check on him. I knocked on the door. No answer. I opened the door and called his name. Still nothing. I walked up to the bed and shook him. He was dead. The rest of that day was awful. I had to call my sister and tell her. I had to tell my uncle, and I was far from home. I called my boyfriend of 7 years at the time, and he assumed I was cheating on him. I wasn't, and refused to talk to me. I felt completely alone and out of place. I was dumbfounded, unable to cry, and suddenly in the position of making funeral arrangements for my father, someone I had only known for 3.5 days. This event really messed me up. When I got home, I dropped out of college. My relationship with my boyfriend plummeted. He was a complete jerk when I needed him most. I spent the next year working through my emotions and trying to process my dad's death, mourning someone I never really got to know. I kept wondering what the hell kind of luck I'd been dealt, saying what the hell over and over until I ran out of breath. At the end of 2016, I decided to leave California and move to Oregon on very short notice. I sold my bikes and my car, and my sister came to pick me up. I moved to be closer to my dad's side of the family, who had been so kind to me when he died. I haven't looked back since. I have a great job, a good man in my life, and a baby on the way. Every year I visit Haystack Rock, the Goonies beach where we scattered my dad's ashes on the anniversary. I have no regrets, but that was probably the craziest plot twist of my life. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an update.